my wife and I desperately needed a break from our hectic city lives. So we booked a secluded modern cabin in the dense woods of western Oregon for a 3-day weekend. The listing described it as a peaceful sanctuary, miles away from the nearest neighbor, featuring floor-to-ceiling glass windows that looked out into the forest. When we arrived on a Friday afternoon, it seemed to be everything we had hoped for. The design was beautiful, constructed of dark wood and glass, surrounded by towering pine trees that blocked out the sun. There was no cell service, but the host had provided a high-speed satellite Wi-Fi connection, which was all we needed. We spent the afternoon unpacking and cooking a quiet dinner. But as night fell, the floor-to-ceiling windows, which had seemed so beautiful during the day, began to feel unsettling. The glass turned into black mirrors, reflecting the interior lights and making it impossible to see what was out there in the dark woods. I went around pulling down the heavy blinds, but the kitchen window didn't have one, leaving a dark pane looking straight out into the trees. Around midnight, my wife was reading on the couch, while I went to the kitchen to get a glass of water. As I stood by the sink, I glanced out the kitchen window. The forest was pitch black, but for a split second, I saw a bright bluish flash from the trees about 50 yards away. It looked exactly like the flash of a camera. I blinked, staring into the darkness, but saw nothing else. I told myself it was probably lightning or a strange reflection from the kitchen lights, and decided not to tell my wife to avoid ruining her mood. The next morning, while my wife was taking a shower, I decided to explore the cabin. In the hallway, I noticed a small wooden door under the stairs. I tried the handle, but it was locked. I checked the Airbnb listing on my phone to see if there was any mention of a locked owner's closet, but there wasn't. It wasn't a major issue, so I shrugged it off and spent the day hiking with my wife. That night, a heavy storm rolled in. The rain hammered against the roof, and the wind shook the pines outside. We went to bed around 11. Because of the storm, I slept lightly, waking up every hour to the sound of thunder. At around 2 a.m., during a brief lull in the storm, I heard a sound that made my chest tighten. It was the sound of floorboards creaking. But the sound wasn't coming from our bedroom, it was coming from directly beneath us. I sat up slowly, trying not to wake my wife. The cabin was a single-story structure raised on concrete pillars, meaning there shouldn't have been anything below us except empty space. I listened intently and heard it again. A slow, heavy footstep, followed by the sound of metal scraping against wood. I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and stepped out into the cold hallway. The living room was empty, the storm howling outside. I walked toward the door under the stairs, my heart pounding in my throat. As I drew closer, my breath caught. The locked door was now slightly open. A thin sliver of pale light was escaping from the gap. I pushed the door open. Behind it was a narrow, steep wooden staircase leading down into a small basement that hadn't been visible from the outside. I crept down the steps, my hand trembling on the railing. The air down there was damp and smelled of dirt. At the bottom of the stairs, the narrow room opened up. On a rough wooden desk sat a glowing computer monitor. I walked over and looked at the screen, and a wave of pure terror washed over me. The monitor displayed 4 live video feeds. One was of the living room. One was of the kitchen. The third was of the bathroom, showing the shower, and the fourth was of our bedroom, showing my wife sleeping in bed at that very moment. They were hidden cameras. Suddenly I heard a wet cough from the dark corner of the basement. I spun around, my flashlight beam cutting through the dust. In the shadows, A tall man in a heavy coat was rising from a mattress on the floor. He held a large wrench in his hand, his eyes wide and vacant. "You shouldn't have come down here," he whispered. I scrambled back up the stairs, screaming for my wife to wake up. I reached the top, slammed the basement door shut, and turned the lock just as the man threw his weight against it from the other side, the wood splintering. My wife ran into the hallway, terrified. "Get your keys. We have to go," I shouted, grabbing her arm. We ran out the front door into the pouring rain. As I unlocked our car, I looked back at the forest. Through the sheets of rain, I saw 3 dark figures standing in the trees, illuminated by the car's headlights. They weren't moving. They were just watching us. We jumped into the car, threw it into drive, and sped down the muddy dirt road, the tires sliding perilously close to the edge. We didn't stop until we reached a police station in the next town. When the deputies went to the cabin the next morning, they found it empty. The computer was gone, the cameras had been removed, and the listing was taken down from the app. The owner of the property claimed they had leased the cabin to a management company and had no idea it was being used to film guests. We never found out who those people in the woods were or what they planned to do with us. But escaping the forest doesn't mean you've left the danger behind. Sometimes the rental itself is a trap, and the host is someone who belongs to the past. For our next story, we travel to an old house in New England, where a traveler discovered that her quiet host was hiding a secret that belonged to the dead. I was traveling through Massachusetts for a history project and decided to rent a room in a historic 19th century house. The listing was for a private room in a home occupied by an elderly woman named Mrs. Gable. She had excellent reviews, with guests praising her quiet demeanor and beautiful antique furniture. When I arrived, Mrs. Gable welcomed me warmly. She was a frail woman in her late 70s, wearing a long, dark dress that seemed out of place in the modern world. She spoke in a soft whisper, telling me she spent most of her time in her private quarters on the first floor, and that I would have the second floor to myself. My room was beautiful, filled with dark oak furniture, an antique vanity mirror, and a massive grandfather clock in the corner. The clock ticked with a heavy metallic sound that echoed through the room. Tock, tock, tock. It was loud, but I figured I'd get used to it. The first night went smoothly, though I had a strange dream that someone was standing at the foot of my bed, whispering numbers in my ear. On the second day, I noticed something. The layout of the house seemed slightly different. I could have sworn there was a door at the end of the second floor hallway the day before, but now there was only a solid wall with floral wallpaper. I assumed I was just tired from my research and let it go. That evening I sat at the antique vanity mirror to brush my hair before bed. The room was dimly lit by a brass lamp. As I looked into the glass, I saw my own reflection, and then my blood ran cold. Reflected in the mirror, standing in the dark corner behind my chair, was a tall, shadow-like figure. Its limbs were unnaturally long, and it stood perfectly still. I spun around, my heart racing, but the corner of the room was empty. I turned back to the mirror, and the shadow was still there in the reflection, standing right behind my chair. I closed my eyes, shook my head, and looked again. This time, the reflection was normal. I convinced myself it was a trick of the dim lighting in the old glass. I went to bed but slept poorly. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to a sudden, crushing silence. The grandfather clock had stopped ticking. The air in the room was freezing, my breath forming pale clouds in the dark. I tried to sit up, but I couldn't move. My arms and legs felt like they were pinned to the mattress by a massive weight. I was experiencing sleep paralysis, something I hadn't had since childhood. I stared at the ceiling trying to breathe when I heard the creak of the bedroom door. Slowly, a figure walked into the room. It was Mrs. Gable. She walked with a slow, mechanical stride, her body stiff. She stopped right beside my bed and leaned over me. In the dim moonlight, I saw her face. It was shifting. The skin on her cheeks looked loose, melting away to reveal a dark, hollow space underneath. Her eyes were completely black, and when she opened her mouth, a low, buzzing, static sound filled the room. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered in a voice that sounded like multiple people speaking at once. "We died in this room. We died in this room." The terror broke my paralysis. I let out a scream, kicked my legs free, and lunged out of the bed. I sprinted out of the room and down the dark stairs, not looking back. I reached the front door and grabbed the handle, but it was locked from the outside with a heavy bolt. I heard Mrs. Gable's stiff, heavy footsteps coming down the stairs behind me. In a panic, I ran to the living room, grabbed a heavy metal candlestick, and smashed the glass of the front window. I scrambled through the broken frame, cutting my hands, and ran out onto the street, screaming for help. A passing motorist stopped and let me into his car, calling the police. When the officers arrived and searched the house, they found it completely empty. The beautiful furniture on the second floor was gone, replaced by thick layers of dust and decay. The police contacted the local property owner. They told us that Mrs. Gable had passed away in that house 2 years prior, and the property had been locked and vacant ever since. The Airbnb listing had been created using an old account that hadn't been accessed in years. I still don't know who welcomed me into that house or whose room I slept in, but I know that some hosts never really leave their homes, even after they are gone. Some rentals hide secrets in the walls, but others require you to follow very specific rules to stay alive. In our final story, a writer learns the hard way why you should never open the door to a stranger in the freezing Colorado snow, even when they look like they need your help. I am a freelance writer, and I often rent remote cabins to get away from distractions and focus on my work. In January of 2024, I rented a small A-frame cabin in a rural area of Colorado. The cabin was surrounded by miles of snow-covered pines, completely isolated. When I arrived, I found a handwritten note on the kitchen counter from the owner. It gave instructions on how to use the wood stove and ended with a strange warning. Keep the fireplace lit at all times during the night, and if someone knocks on the door after midnight, do not open it, no matter what they say. I laughed and threw the note in the trash. I assumed it was just a local legend or the owner trying to scare city folks. The first 2 nights were peaceful. I wrote for hours, enjoying the absolute silence of the mountains, but on the 3rd night, a massive blizzard hit. The wind howled through the trees, throwing snow against the windows. Around 1 a.m., I was sitting by the warm fireplace, typing on my laptop, when I heard it. A soft, hesitant knock on the front door. I froze. I remembered the owner's note, but then I told myself it was ridiculous. It was a freezing blizzard outside, below 0. If someone was out there, they would die of hypothermia. I walked to the door and looked through the peephole. Standing on the snow-covered porch was a young woman. She wore a thin summer dress, completely soaked in snow. She was shivering violently, her head bowed, her hands pressed against her chest. "Please," she sobbed, her voice carrying through the wooden door. "Please help me. My car broke down. I'm so cold." My protective instincts kicked in. I couldn't leave a girl to freeze to death. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. "Come in quick," I said, stepping aside. She walked past me into the warm cabin. But as she passed, a wave of freezing air hit me, an air so cold it smelled of old ice and decay. I closed the door and locked it, turning to look at her. She stood in the middle of the living room facing the wall. She was no longer shivering. She stood perfectly still. "Let me get you a blanket," I said, my voice suddenly trembling. As I walked toward her, I noticed something that made my heart drop. The bright light from the fireplace was shining directly on her back, but there was no shadow on the floor behind her. She didn't cast a shadow. "Are you okay?" I asked, backing away slowly. The woman slowly turned her head around. She didn't turn her body, just her neck, twisting it at an unnatural 90-degree angle. Her face was pale, almost blue, and her eyes were completely hollow, wide open and filled with dark ice. She opened her mouth, and an inhuman, screeching howl tore from her throat. The sound was so loud it shook the glasses on the counter. In a panic, I ran to the fireplace and grabbed a burning piece of pine wood from the hearth. I held it out in front of me like a torch. The entity shrank back from the fire, its blue skin blistering as the heat drew near. It let out another shriek, turned, and bolted toward the front door. It didn't unlock the door. It just slammed its body against the wood, shattering the lock and the frame before disappearing into the swirling blizzard outside. I stood by the shattered doorway, holding the burning log, my body shaking with fear. For the rest of the night, I stayed right next to the roaring fireplace, feeding it wood until the flames reached the top of the chimney. Outside in the dark, I could hear something circling the cabin, scratching against the wooden walls, whispering my name in a voice that sounded like the wind. As soon as the sun rose, I packed my bags, jumped into my truck, and left, not even stopping to close the door. I contacted the cabin owner later and told him what happened. He was silent for a long moment before saying, "I told you to keep the fire lit. They only come in when you invite them. I don't rent cabins in the winter anymore. And whenever I hear a knock on my door after midnight, I ignore it and make sure my fireplace is burning bright." If you've ever booked an isolated cabin online, hoping for a peaceful getaway, you might want to double-check who owns the property and what might be lurking in the attic or just outside the door. If these stories made your next vacation feel a little less safe, please subscribe to The Dark Hour for more chilling tales. Let me know in the comments, would you open the door to a stranger in a freezing blizzard? I'll see you in the dark.